Hi, this is Thomas, and I realized that there's not very much material to understand what are the requirements for Conversational AI Project 3, so I decided to make this video to help people understand how to host a server and user interface on Render and have them communicate. I'll be showing some of the errors that you might be running into, and so we can get the project done. Alright, so first things first is you're going to want to create a virtual environment for your server so you can manage your dependencies properly. Just go ahead and pip install everything you see here. Just follow along. One thing to note here is I pre-recorded the video without audio, so I'm recording the audio afterwards. But what you see here is basically a bare bones implementation of a Flask server. One thing I made a mistake of because I didn't recognize that the render server uses Linux is we actually don't need the waitress installation for running a production server. But one thing you will want to do is check the environment for a production variable so we can modify some settings when the server gets launched or built on render. Now we just start the Flask server here, and you can see that you get the warning because it's not like a production ready server, but Render will handle this automatically with GUnicorn. Now what I'm doing here is I'm just checking the production environment variable that we set to manually configure the server upon instantiation because we want different settings. Like for example in production, you don't want to set the debug value to true because if people can debug your server if they get into it, it makes it easier for them to figure out how to get around it. And here you can see we're just setting the host, and in production the port and host will be determined by render, so you don't have to set those, but we can set them manually on the on our local host. So now what I have here is an application called Postman. This is a really good API testing tool. So what we did is created a HTTP request, and we're going to send a request to the server to make sure that we get our data back. Make sure it's a post request, and then we're going to go into body, select raw, go to JSON, and then type in some JSON that we can send to the server. As you can see, the reason why we set post is because our method for the route is post, because typically with a post request you're sending data to the server. You can see we get a 200 response and our data gets sent back to us. Alright, so what's next is we're going to create a GitHub repository for the server. We'll also be doing this for the client. I just named mine Flask render example, and I'll make it public so you guys can see the code if you need to refer to it. Please don't copy it line for line, because if you guys all do that, you might get in trouble. But so what we do now is we want to follow the second example here. First we initialize our repository locally, and then we want to, and the reason why we didn't include a README is so the process of this goes a little smoother. Otherwise you have to pull from the online repository and then push. It's just a nuisance, so just don't do a README on the start. If you want to create a README, then do it on your local machine and then push the README. But you'll see I created a gitignore file here because we don't want to include our Python environment, because there's a lot of files, like 3,000 plus for all the libraries and whatnot. So make sure you add that to a gitignore, and then we commit the changes, and then we add the remote. Then we push the changes to GitHub. And we can see here when we refresh on GitHub, our code will be there. Now the next step is creating a web service on render. First you'll want to sign in. Probably have to create an account first, but if you use like a GitHub provider, you can just sign in directly. You might need to authorize render when you do that, but that's okay. So this is where I fixed the problem with the waitress import. This is when I realized we didn't need to use waitress to serve a production server, so you can literally just type app.run here and it'll work as a production server. It's pretty neat. And then we can uninstall the waitress library because it's no longer needed. So next thing, we're going to read the Flask app documentation on render to figure out how they're hosting their server. So we can see that their entry point is app.py and ours is example.py. And they also have a requirements.txt file which will be installed on the build process, so all the dependencies are there when GUnicorn tries to host or start the server. Now it's really important that you have this requirements.txt file or your Python server will not run. Next step is to commit the requirements file to GitHub before we host the server on render. And just to keep in mind here, the DialogFlow library that I installed initially is actually an old version. You'll see further in the video the change that we make. The DialogFlow package is supposed to come from Google Cloud. This is an old version, but we'll fix it later in the video. On render, we're now going to want to create the web service because we have our GitHub repository set up and our server code. So go to new, web service, and then build and deploy from a GitHub repository. Now if you didn't sign up with your GitHub, you may have to configure your account, but you want to go to the links here that I'm following and select repositories, and then find the name of your Flask server and then add it to the list of selected repositories. After you've done that, you can just click save and it'll redirect you back to render, and you can see your server code will be there. And now what we want to do is you just give the website a name. This will be the front-facing name for the free version of your application. So anything you put in the name there, it's going to be the URL for your website. And then we just select Python 3 runtime, and then make sure the build command is showing there. And then, so this I screw up. You want to actually do example double colon app, or it's not going to work. Another thing that we're going to want to do is set a production environment variable so the server knows that we're running in production. I'm fairly certain that render has one of these by default, but I don't feel like figuring what that is right now, so we'll just make our own production environment variable. And you can close that and then it'll save, and then we create the web service. Once you click create web service, you'll see that the render will automatically pull the latest commit from your repository. As you can see, ACC 3628, I think that is. And then it'll build your environment and run the server. I'm going to be skipping forward a lot of these build steps because they consume a lot of the time in the video. So you'll see here when I first try to run it, we get that error that I was talking about where I set the start command wrong, so we can go into settings and edit that if it's not working. Just change those around, save the changes, and then anytime you update an environment variable, Render will automatically redeploy your website, so you don't have to worry about like doing anything on GitHub. It just does it all automatically. It's nice. So when your build finishes, you should get this starting GUnicorn listening on HTTP 000 port 1 or 10,000. Now, one way we can test this locally is if you copy the URL at the top left of Render there, and then paste it in here with your proper route, and then we send some JSON data, we can get a response back to confirm that the server is running properly. I read some documentation, and apparently a better way to fetch environment variables with the OS import is using the getIn function. Apparently it's more reliable and works on more platforms, so we're going to use that one instead. I think the other one is for if you've set environment variables in this particular Python environment. After we make those changes, we just want to repush our code to GitHub, and I'll give you an example here of the pipeline. Is that GitHub or Render will automatically detect the latest commit to your repository and automatically upload the code. Now, this is only based off of the branch that it's targeting, so if you have like a development branch that you're developing on, you don't have to worry about it automatically repushing that. It's only to the branch that you specify. Next step is installing the correct DialogFlow package. So here in the documentation I found the correct package afterwards. So just remove the old DialogFlow package that we installed, or uninstall it. That's an npm thing. And then just install the correct one, and then we'll figure out how to get this set up. The next steps you're going to want to follow step by step when setting up the Google Cloud credentials. If you don't, it's not going to work. So go to your DialogFlow project and go to your settings and find your project ID link. This will take you to your Google Cloud console. And then once you're here, you want to go to Services and APIs, or APIs and Services and Credentials. And the first step is to configure the consent screen. You can create it as an external. And then you just want to fill out this form, basically give your app name. This can be different from the app name on Render. You don't need a logo. It's only if you're like planning on actually making money from the website. And then you want to copy the server URL to app domain. Now, you might get this error here. That's because you haven't added the application homepage as an authorized domain. So you'll see here I remove it because I was like kind of confused. Haven't done this in like a minute. So I add myself as a developer contact information, and then I'm like thinking, and then I remember that, oh yeah, we have to add the URL here as an authorized domain. And then we can add the application homepage. And then save and continue. Now the next step is configuring the scopes for the consent screen. This is important because when you set up the credentials key, you'll see there will be different options based off of the scopes that you set here. You can either use owner just to give yourself like overall like control. I think it enables like all the APIs. But if you want DialogFlow Service Agent specifically, you can select the API scope from here. It takes me about a minute to find it, but I do find it. So you select that, and then you can click Update. and then save and continue. Now, the mistake I made here was adding myself as a test user. You don't do this because you're the owner, so it really wouldn't make sense to add yourself as a test user. I kind of derped here, but you can, if you do the same thing as I do, you can just go to the edit button there and then remove yourself as a test user. And once we're done all that, we can go back to the dashboard and create our credentials. So go back to the Credentials tab, create a service account. You can give the service account whatever name you want. I just call it Flask Render Demo Service Account. You can give it a description if you want, but you don't really need to. Just click Create and Continue. And then the next step here is you'll see roles. So this is the scopes that we specified before. If you only want to use it as a dialog service agent, you can select that one, but I didn't want to take the chances of authorizations not working for some reason, so I just selected all. And then you don't have to worry about that step. We can just click continue. Okay, so now you'll see your service account is created. Click on the service account link, and you want to go to keys, and we're going to add a key. Kind of just like scrolling around here, derping. But you want to create a new key, make sure it's a JSON key, and then save this somewhere on your computer. I'm just saving it in the directory of the project that I'm making here as an example. Now, one thing that's really important is that you do not commit this key to GitHub. Otherwise, people will have control over your Google authentication, and they will be able to access your Google account information if they figure out how to hack your server. It's not a good thing. So make sure you do not commit this to GitHub. You can achieve that by adding the file to the GitHub or the .gitignore file. If your key.json file is highlighted green, that means it hasn't been added to the .gitignore. Make sure you do that. It's very important. But what you see here is I have a default implementation of the Google DialogFlow. So I'm just importing everything at the top here. And then we set, now for like most Google services that you integrate into your projects, you can specify a Google Applications Credentials key, like I have here, and it'll look in the root directory of your project for that file to load and authenticate the services that you use for Google Cloud products. This is why I recommend this method. It's a lot easier. Secondly, you can see I just instantiate a sessions client, and then I create a session using the create session path variable, and then I create some text input. You can change this to audio input too. I think DialogFlow supports all of that. And then you want to inject the text input into a query input. It's basically like an encapsulation class that handles like various different types of inputs. And then we call the session client.detect intent to actually send our message to DialogFlow, and then we can get the response back and view everything that's going on. So I'll run this file and you'll see what happens. So you can see we get our detected intent confidence and the fulfillment text. Next thing is to copy all of the test code for our DialogFlow into our Flask API, because we want to be able to access this via REST request. So just follow along here with what I'm doing. Now I fast forward here because I kind of screwed up implementing the code, but if you need to reference it, it'll be on GitHub. Essentially, I just put the text input and query input all into the route, and then we move the detect input into the try except block, and then we pass the response back to the client that requests the data. So I'm rerunning the server here. And this is also where I make a mistake by trying to JSONify the whole response from the DialogFlow. It's not serializable, so make sure that you're only sending back the fulfillment text. You'll see here, once I send a message, I get an error. So detect intent response is not JSON serializable. So what I did is I just passed like a dictionary here with response, and this will work. Voila, server is looking good so far. Now, before we work too far ahead, we're going to want to test to make sure that the DialogFlow is working on render. So what you see me here is I add my key.json to my gitignore because I've made this mistake a few too many times. And so now how to get this on render is you can add a secret file in your render settings under environment. You basically want to just give it the same name as your file in your local directory, and then you paste the contents here. So once you save that, the next thing we want to do is update our requirements.txt. Make sure you remove the old DialogFlow and add a new one. And then once you do that, we can recommit the repository to render, and it will automatically update on their side and host the new code. The deploy was a success. Now, how to test this is I'm just going to use Postman again to confirm that I can get a response from my DialogFlow agent on the live server. Alright, for the client, I'm going to be using a framework called SolidJS. You can use any framework that you like, but it needs to be able to build to a static website. I think you can host plain HTML, but you might have some troubles if you do that. So I'm just going to do npm create a v at 4.4.1. It's important that you have that. And then the little period at the end specifies that I want it in this directory. And then we do a double hyphen and then a double hyphen template solid ts. You can just do a solid if you want to use JavaScript, but because we're GigaChads, we use TypeScript. And if you want to follow along, use TypeScript. We run the npm install command to install the dependencies that were provided to us by the Vite template. And then there's going to be a little bit of pre-setup that we need to go through here because I like to make things painful, and I'm using Tailwind CSS with a prettier plugin, so my styles get automatically sorted and everything is a lot easier to do down the road when you make a bigger project. But you can see there, SolidJS launched properly. Now the next thing we're going to want to do is install all of the dependencies. So the first thing I do is I install the dev dependencies. You're going to want to make sure that you follow this word for word. If you're using TypeScript, you're going to need the node types. Otherwise, don't worry about that. You will need the auto prefixer. You will need the post CSS library, and you will also need Tailwind CSS. The next step is to run npx tailwind css init with a p command. This will initialize Tailwind CSS with the post CSS config as well, which will be important for running or for compiling your code down so it can detect the Tailwind types, or the styles, sorry. The next thing we'll be doing is installing actual dependencies. Just install all of the dependencies that I have here, and then click enter. Again, this code will be publicly available on GitHub, so you guys can refer to it if you miss something in the video, or if I don't explain it properly. So one thing we're going to want to do for VS Code is set up a prettier config. This will allow Prettier to automatically sort our Tailwind styles for us, which can help a lot with cleaning up your code and just making it look better. Because all of your styles will have the same order, and you don't have to think about it while you're typing it. Now I go into my VS Code's user settings here. You're going to want to copy this and use it for yourself. If you don't, then IntelliSense will not be able to autocomplete the Tailwind styles for you. Here I'm just kind of going over the config files to make sure that everything is right. So in our Tailwind config, you're going to want to set the plugin here, and then the content that Tailwind looks for will be everything within the source directory with a glob pattern of JSX, TSX, HTML, JS, and TS. And then we also want to include the index.html file. And then dark mode is class-based. That's just an option if you plan on using dark mode on your application. I will not be demonstrating that in this example though. And then here I like adding this font family because I think it looks better than the default browser fonts. And make sure you copy this post CSS config. This is the post CSS import. This will make it so your Tailwind styles actually show up in the development version of your website. That's the base of the setup for the UI. One thing I forgot to mention is to check your node version before you go into this. You're going to want to make sure you have version 18 or version 20.9. I believe the process is the same for version 18, but you can use a tool called Node Version Manager to handle all of that for you. One thing that's also important for production environments is you will need to set up the injection point for the Vite environment. It's basically tells Vite where your bundle is. And where to find the index.html when it goes into production. Next thing you're also going to want to do is install the Prettier Code Formatter extension and the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense plugin. That's for the auto completion and the user settings that we set up earlier. Alright, if you're using TypeScript, you're going to want to define a types.declaration file. This is basically where you can set all of your TypeScript types and export them. These are the only two types that we're going to need, is the onChange and onSubmit. This will handle the typing of the object that, or the event object that gets sent to us from the user interface. Next, go into your app.tsx and remove all of the code here that we don't need. This includes the signal. We can also remove the app.css file, the SolidJS SVG, and that's about all we need to remove. And then you want to copy and paste these into your index.css. They're just Tailwind directives that help set up the project and let our project or the CSS know that we're going to be using Tailwind styling. Then you're going to want to go into the index.html in the root of the directory and link the style sheet. You can ignore the warning in the console. It was just a slight oversight by me. In the previous app.tsx file, we don't have the app.css anymore, so it's looking for that but can't find it. But what I do here is I go into the inspector to make sure that the Tailwind styles are being applied. Then first I recognize the app.css is not there, so I just remove that. The project will hot reload, no more error. And then I inspect the root element to make sure that the Tailwind styles are being applied properly, which it looks like they are. Next, typically when you're writing client code, you want to make sure that you sanitize all of the input that comes in from the user. And again, if you're using JavaScript, you won't need this string type declaration, but you want to sanitize all of your input before it goes to the server, because string injections and people will send JavaScript as a string text to your server to try to do nasty things. So make sure that you sanitize your input. That's a very poor example of sanitization, but it's just an example. And then the next thing is we create a signal in SolidJS, and this basically manages the state of our values. And you just call the create signal here, and then deconstruct the two functions into from the array. The input value is a function that contains the actual input, and the set input value updates the state for us. So here you can see I'm adding the onChange type from our file, and you can see here we have this /types import, and I don't like those kind of imports. So what we do here is we add a paths variable to our tsconfig, which will allow us to use modular imports. They look a lot nicer. You basically just create a JSON object, the name of the modular import that you want, and then the directory which contains the exports or the file that you want to import the types from. This has to be an array or it gets mad. And so now we can change this to add types and it'll still work. Now we just want to finish our handle input change button. So like I said, the deconstructed set input value function is our state setter. So you want to sanitize the input before it goes in, or before you set the state, but that'll basically handle our input there. Simple as that. One thing I overlooked is you actually need to use the tsconfigs paths plugin from V. The paths will still work, but I don't think you'll actually see the types properly. So you just add this here and it'll make the paths variable work. Now I'm going to copy and paste some code here to speed things up from the example project that I wrote. This is basically the function that will handle the submission to the server. As you can see, we need the onSubmit type. This is the other type that I said that we needed. And then we will need the Axios library for performing the post request. And you can see here, we just have a handle submit function that's asynchronous. I'm not going to go into too much detail what that is now. E.prevent default keeps your page from refreshing on a form submission. But you don't need that if it's just a plain button that's not inside a form. Console.log the sending data just to make sure that we're sending what we want. And then with credentials is important if you want to add headers such as authorization for like server-based or server sessions. But basically what you see here is just axios.post to the URL that contains the endpoint for the server with the data from the input value, and then we're just kind of logging out the response from the server. Now I copy paste some more code here that's like a very default form just for sending. This is an example of using the IntelliSense with Tailwind. It's pretty good. And then so I'll pull up the UI here. You can see it looks very jank, but it works. So when we submit the test query, we're going to run into a very annoying problem that happens with every single UI server structure where you have a client that's separated from your server, and it's called the cores. I will give you a step-by-step process on how to fix this with the Flask server, because this is probably going to be one of the most annoying problems for most people. Alright, so in our Flask server code, you can see I have a cores object here that basically takes in the app, and then we set support credentials to true. That's for server sessions. We set the origin of the UI, which was the localhost at the port generated by Vite. And then to get cores, you need to use pip install flask cores. And then the method is post get in options. You need options because that's a request that's supplied almost with every request. And then the allowed headers option is also important, or the cores will fail. Now here I screwed up because I didn't realize that my Vite server had changed the port on me. And then you want to make sure you actually like stop the server and restart it, or it won't work. But you can see the cores error goes away once we have this code on the server. Now that our user interface is set up and able to communicate with the server, we want to do the same thing we did earlier with the server and create a Git repository that will act as a pipeline to upload our code to render. Here I'm just git adding and git committing the files. It doesn't matter what order you do it in as long as you set up your Git repository. And don't worry about the naming conventions. Python has been screwing me up. So just name it whatever you like. Again, this code will be public so you guys can look at it if you need reference. So now we just want to add the origin. And then we can push the commit to GitHub. Now that our code's on GitHub, we want to create a static site. Now the difference between a static site and a web service is the static site will just host your HTML and JavaScript, and a web service is usually something a little more advanced than that. It's hard to explain, but don't worry about it. So we just want to connect our user interface code to render. Once you've authorized the repository, just click connect, like we did with the server. Give your front-facing client a name. And then we want to replace the build command with npm run build. And we want to set the publishing directory as /dist, because that's where the files are contained. If I run a build command here, just for example, you can see what happens is our bundle gets compiled down to assets and it is contained in a dist folder. This is what gets hosted on render. That's where I realized that we can also delete the public vite.svg. I didn't see that hiding there when I was setting this up. One thing you'll notice is that vite gives us a .ignore file that contains a bunch of important ignores by default. You don't really need to touch that. So now what we can do is we can push our code to GitHub. And if you've already pushed it, you can do a manual commit on their side. But because I haven't actually created the site yet, we can just let it do its thing. One thing I do here is I do set the node versions for the front-end project, the Python version, because they use Python and Ruby to build the project. So I just like to make sure that like everything's up to date. You don't have to do this. Everything should work just by default, but I like to be up to date. I also did this for the client, I just didn't show it. Again, I'm going to skip through most of the build command, but at the end you can see that it should show up as your site is live. Hopefully, if it worked. And then we can view our website live, and it all looks the same as it did in development, which is the goal. So now what we want to do is figure out how to determine whether we're working in a production or development environment so we can set up the core's stuff properly. Now on the client side, we want to add a .env file. These are natively supported by vite, but if you don't have vite, you can do npm install .env, or I think it's just env, one of the two, you can look it up. But we also need to prefix all of our environment variables with vite underscore because we're in a vite environment. If you're not working in a vite environment, you don't have to worry about that. So after we've done that and we've saved that, and also make sure you add that .env file to gitignore as best practices, because you're supposed to manually set up your environment variables in the settings on your client on render. Now to access your environment variables, you want to use the import statement .meta.env. And if we console.log that and rerun the project, we should see in the console a string that says production. Or development, I guess. I said it as development dirt. Alright, so we'll get rid of the console log since we don't need that anymore. And then what we're going to want to do is create a constant or a variable that tells our client if we're in production. You can find this again on the import.meta.env object, and then we access the vite production key, and we just want to check to make sure that's equal to production. And that'll give us a true or false value based on our environment. Usually you want to set that up in a config folder, but we're being lazy right now. And then the next thing we want to do is set up a target URL that is equal to a URL that changes based off of whether it is production or true or false. This is called a ternary statement. Basically, the bit after the double colon is if production is false, and the bit after the question mark is if production is true. So go to your Flask or your render client, copy the URL and paste it here. So that'll be our target URL. Make sure that this doesn't contain any route points or server endpoints. And then we just do some string interpolation here to set up the variable to be dynamic based off of the environment. Now that we have that set up, we're going to git add and git commit the changes to GitHub, because I want to show you an example again of the CORS error that you're likely going to run into if you don't see it coming. So once we push this to render, once we push the code to GitHub, it will automatically deploy. I guess it would be a good idea to set up your v production environment variable here first before you do that, so it can actually see where it needs to point to. So once we push that, the build will start. Another problem I noticed while I was pushing my code to render is the extension for the prettier config file I got wrong. It's not supposed to be CJS, it's supposed to be just .js. This allows you to use the default exports rather than having to do module.exports, because it seems like the ecosystem is moving in towards ESM or just default JS here, so don't do the module.exports. So you'll see our website is looking good. One thing to take note here is if you haven't touched your server in, like, I think it's more than 30 minutes or something like that, it will go into a cold state and it will need to do an entire reboot. This can take anywhere from like 15 seconds to a minute. If you want to avoid this, you can pay for a subscription on Render, but I don't recommend it for this project. I would just stick with waiting for the server to boot back up. So I skipped ahead a bit, and we can see I got the infamous CORS error again. So what's going on here is that our server doesn't have the proper origin set up for our UI. Now you can do it like this as an array, but a better practice is so you're not allowing the localhost URL as well, is we're going to create an origin environment variable that gets set based off of the value of the production environment. So now if production is true, we want to use the render URL, and if it's false, then we want to use the localhost URL, because that means that we're in development. Now there's two things I forgot to do before, or there's one thing I screwed up and there's one thing I forgot to do before pushing the code, was you need to add the Flask CORS dependency to the requirements.txt so Render can download and install it for your server. And the second thing that I screwed up, or the thing that I screwed up, was the URL that I set for the allowed origins in the server was wrong. I accidentally added the server URL and not the client URL. Make sure that you add the client URL or you're going to get the cross origins error like I did. Here I'm just recommitting the files to my Git repository, so that'll automatically reflect on Render and they'll redeploy my server with the correct origin, and now it should work. I'm going to skip ahead of the build process and get right to the UI part. Now when I make a request from the client, we can see we no longer get a CORS error, and we're getting the data back from our production server, which is on render. Now this is basically confirms that we are able to, one, the DialogFlow agent is working in production, and we are able to communicate with our server from the client. So the next steps are basically just editing the request to go to your DialogFlow endpoint, and then you want to modify the data going to the server to send a message based off of your text input. And then here I create a state variable called DialogFlow response, just so we can log the response to the client. Now I made two mistakes when I tried to push this and submit the query. One was that the JSON key needs to be messaged because that's what our server is expecting for the value. The second error is I didn't call the input value function. When you're extracting a value from a signal, you need to call it as a function. And on top of that, when I created the signal earlier for the DialogFlow response, I didn't supply an empty string to the create signal function, which will throw an error on the UI. This is where I believe I noticed that the value needed to be a string. This is the final cleanup of the video. Here I just gotta put the server and the client side by side to confirm all of the key values and data types, just to make sure that everything is working before I push the data to the server again. And yeah, that's where I highlighted the create signal error. This is basically the working version of the code. I believe I've already pushed this to GitHub, so now the last thing to do is just to test it live. And hopefully, if everything went well, you'll get the same result that I got. Thank you for watching the video. I hope this helps. Sorry for such jank recording, but I was in quite a rush to make this and I don't have a video editor. Hope you enjoy.